to rise today to speak to Bill S-241, better known by its short title, the Jane Goodale Act. For a Senate public bill, I must say that this legislation has garnered a fair amount of interest. I am sure that some of it is due to the fact that Jane Goodale herself has endorsed the legislation and lent her name to it. And some of it is reflective of the growing public interest in the welfare of animals in human care. Writers have used adjectives like landmark and global leader to describe the bill. Humane Society International has called it some of the strongest legislation for wild animals in captivity and wildlife protection in the world. Although by now you are probably well versed in the contents of the bill, allow me please to summarize a little bit of what the bill does. Bill S-241 amends the sections of the criminal code to create offensive respecting the ownership, breeding, and possession of the reproductive material of exotic animals, specifically great apes, elephants, and certain non-domesticated animals referred to as designated animals. Bill S-241 also amends the Wild Animal and Plant Protection and Regulation of International and Interprovincial Trade Act to require a permit for the import, export, interprovincial transport, and captive breeding of great apes, elephants, and designated animals. In addition, the bill creates a legislative framework for the recognition of animal care organizations, which are organizations that meet certain standards for the care of animals and will be exempt from prohibitions contained in this bill. The bill also creates limited legal standing for animals by allowing an animal advocate to be appointed to represent the animal's interests in sentencing phase of a trial. Senators, I want to make it clear at the outset that I support the intent of this bill to give greater protection to animals held in captivity in Canada. Currently, there is a patchwork of federal, provincial, and municipal laws and regulations which govern the zoo industry and the private ownership of exotic animals. In many cases, the existing framework leaves much to be desired. I also support the bill's aim to address the illegal trade in wild animals and their body parts, which is driving some species closer to extinction. There is no debate, colleagues, over the need to stop the illegal trafficking of endangered species. However, while I support the intent of the bill, I am very concerned that it is a clumsy effort at a noble cause, which will have more negative impacts than positive ones. I believe we can and must do better. In order to understand the scope of this legislation, it is necessary to understand that exotic wildlife in captivity in Canada falls into three categories: accredited zoos, non-accredited zoos, and private ownership. Zoos which are accredited in Canada receive this accreditation through either Canada's Accredited Zoos and Aquariums, known as CAZA, or through the U.S.-based counterpart, the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, known as AZA. These accreditation associations are industry-led, nonprofit organizations which set minimum standards for animal welfare and work to promote zoos as agencies of conservation, science, and education. According to some estimates, there are currently about 100 zoos, aquariums, wildlife displays, and zoo-type exhibits in Canada. These include small displays in retail stores, all the way up to large institutions such as the Calgary Zoo or the Assiniboine Park Zoo in Winnipeg. Yet only about 27 of these zoos or exhibits are accredited, including 24 accredited by CAZA, 3 accredited by AZA alone, and 4 accredited by AZA and CAZA. The remaining 75 zoos fall into a very broad category of unaccredited zoos. Amongst unaccredited zoos in Canada, there is a wide range in the quality of animal care. Some of them may in fact be eligible for accreditation and have simply not pursued it. Others would require major upgrades in their facilities, staff, and operations in order to qualify for accreditation. It is a fact that without accreditation, the existing standards and regulations are insufficient for Canadians to be confident that all animals held in those zoos are provided with proper care. Included in the category of unaccredited zoos are those that are commonly referred to as roadside zoos. These are the zoos which we have often heard described in this chamber during debates on Bill S-241. And so that we all understand what we are referring to, allow me to read the definition of roadside zoos according to the World Society for the Protection of Animals. The roadside zoo is a grossly substandard, usually amateur facility which lacks trained, experienced animal care staff, proper funding, and safety practices. Animals are confined to small, barren, often filthy cages with next to nothing to do day in and day out. First of all, that's not always the case, but, colleagues, let me be abundantly clear. Nobody is trying to defend the existence of substandard roadside zoos. The question is how this issue should be addressed and which level of government should be doing it. Thirdly, in addition to accredited zoos and non-accredited zoos, the personal ownership of exotic animals is also permitted in Canada. Exact numbers do not exist, but the results of a survey done by World Animal Protection have extrapolated to estimate that there are about 1.4 million exotic pets in private ownership in Canada. This includes almost 500,000 reptiles, 500,000 exotic birds, and over 300,000 exotic mammals such as tigers, lions, leopards, foxes, monkeys, etc. As pointed out by Senator Klein, it is estimated that there are over 4,000 privately owned big cats in Canada. However, the term big cat is typically used to refer to tigers, lions, jaguars, leopards, cheetahs, and cougars. And World Animal Protection puts the estimated number in Canada at over 7,000. This does not include the big cats in zoos and wildlife reserves. This is strictly the estimated number of big cats being held as personal pets. I personally find this, colleagues, unacceptable. However, I intend to show you that Bill S-241 is not the way forward. It carries the precision of an elephant in a china shop or a tiger in a chicken coop. It will not get the job done, and it will make a very, very large mess in the process of trying. In order to explain, I need to circle back to the talk about accredited zoos. Accredited zoos are probably not the zoos that you remember visiting as a child. Those were more likely on par with today's existing roadside zoos, where we find most of the problems in today's industry. In contrast, roadside zoos are the accredited zoo level the industry is driven by a deep commitment to education, conservation, science, and research. And this is what the Bill S-241 threatens. In my role as critic of this bill, I have so far managed to visit 10 of the 27 accredited zoos in Canada and saw firsthand some of the great work they are doing. It honestly is very inspiring. Let me start with the Assiniboine Park Zoo in my city of Winnipeg, where I met Grant Furness, who was the senior director of the Assiniboine Park Conservancy, along with Clement Lanthier, president and CEO of the Calgary Zoo, and Len Wolstenholme, Senior Advisor to the Calgary Zoo. The Assiniboine Zoo is an impressive facility. It is a nonprofit corporation owned by the City of Winnipeg and home to more than 150 animal species and over 80 acres to explore. The zoo is an accredited member of AZA, CAZA, and WAZA, the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums. In its own words, Assiniboine Park Zoo focuses on meeting and exceeding the ever-rising standards of animal care and welfare, safety, and veterinary programs, and as well as demonstrating a commitment to education, conservation, and research. There is a lot packed into that statement, but I heard the same themes over and over and over at every accredited zoo I visited. Animals are under increasing pressure everywhere you turn due to the loss of habitat and the impacts of climate change. Accredited zoos and wildlife reserves play a critical educational role in helping to create public awareness of these challenges, giving people the opportunity to connect with animals and in conserving species at risk. The second zoo I visited was the Calgary Zoo. I had met, as I said, Clement Lanthier and Len Wolstenholme of the Calgary Zoo earlier in Winnipeg. But this was an opportunity to see their zoo's operations from behind the scene as Len toured us around their great facilities. The Calgary Zoo is owned by the City of Calgary and operated by the Calgary Zoological Society, an independent, not-for-profit organization. Last year, over 1.2 million people visited this zoo, with over 4,000 animals spread over 125 acres. You simply cannot see everything in one day. Perhaps that's why many people take out season passes at the zoo. They can enjoy the animals and the environment throughout the entire year. I was able to spend an afternoon at the Calgary Zoo, so there was much that I did not get to see. But what I did see was remarkable. After Calgary, my staff was able to visit the Toronto Zoo. Once again, this is a world-class facility doing impressive work on research, conservation, and education regarding animal species. It was here we learned that animals in human care live 30% longer, colleagues, than they would in the wild when they receive proper care. With their own wildlife nutrition center, the Wildlife Health Center and the Toronto Zoo provides world-class care to animals which make their home there. Following the Toronto Zoo was the African Lion Safari located near Hamilton, Ontario. This is a zoo that a few years earlier I had as well visited with my entire family. Unlike the Toronto, Calgary, and Assiniboine Park zoos, this facility is not owned by a municipality, but is privately owned and operated. But if you were expecting a lower grade operation, you would be disappointed. The conservation research and the education efforts taking place there are equally impressive, especially when you consider that none of it is being done with tax dollars. African Lion Safari is comprised of over 750 acres, 250 of which provide animals with large areas of bush, grasslands, or forest in which they can interact naturally with other animals. With 250 acres for animals to roam, that's twice as much space as the Calgary Zoo and 3 times as much space as the Assiniboine Park Zoo. Almost 30 acres of the 750 total has been developed for walk-through areas and exhibits, and the balance of the property is comprised of farm, bush, and other habitat, including 40 acres of provincially significant wetland, which African Safari maintains and monitors. It is a conservationists dream. In several of their wildlife reserves, mixed species roam and interact as they would in the wild. But in all 7 reserves, it's the people who are kept caged, not the animals. The animals roam freely over large enclosures, while visitors drive through and view the animals from the safety of their vehicles. The park sees 500,000 visitors every year over the 6-month period that they are open to the public. They have 50 full-time staff and hire 300 seasonal staff. And like other accredited zoos I already mentioned, African Lion Safari has an impressive track record in conservation work. They have over 1,000 animals comprised of over 100 species. And as with the Calgary Zoo, 1/3 of their animals are endangered species. The park has been successful in breeding 30 species that are considered endangered and 20 species that are considered threatened. This, colleagues, is no small feat and is in keeping with their vision to help maintaining self-sustaining populations of species in decline, an incredible service to future generations. The Wildlife Reserve is also renowned for its research and conservation efforts, including giraffes, Asian elephants, blue-throated macaws, eastern loggerhead shrikes, barn owls, bald eagles, and rhinos. In conducting their research, they have collaborated with prestigious universities such as McGill University, Queen's University, Indiana University Bloomington, Cornell University, Auburn University, Baylor University, Tokyo University of Agriculture and Technology, University College London, University of Florida, University of Guelph, University of Melbourne, University of Pennsylvania, University of Pretoria, Western Kentucky University, and many more. And yet, colleagues, the wrecking ball called S-241 threatens to destroy the great work being done by this institution. While the Toronto Zoo, the Calgary Zoo, and the Assiniboine Park Zoo are protected by this legislation, the African Lion Safari is not, even though it too is a fully accredited zoo. Let me explain. Bill S-241 makes it a criminal offense to, 1, own, have custody of, or control a great ape, elephant, or designated animal that is held in captivity. 2, breed, impregnate, or fail to take reasonable care to prevent the breeding or impregnation of a great ape, elephant, or designated animal. And 3, possess to seek to obtain reproductive materials of great apes, elephants, or designated animals. The bill then goes on to list the exceptions to this being an offense. For example, if the animal was in captivity on the day that this law comes into effect, it is not an offense for those animals to remain in captivity. Basically, it grandfathers every elephant, great ape, big cat, or other designated animal that is already in captivity. Those animals can continue to be legally kept, but not bred, until the day they die, as long as their captivity is uninterrupted. The bill also makes an exception if the animal is being kept in captivity for the purpose of conducting non-harmful scientific research or in the best interest of the animals, with regard to individual welfare and conservation of the species, providing that the person keeping the animal has a license to do so issued by the federal or provincial government. In addition, an elephant, great ape, or designated animal can be kept in captivity if it is in the ownership, custody, or control of a person who is employed by a province or municipality, or appointed or employed by a provincial or municipal body, or is an employee of a federal entity set out in the Schedules 1 to 5 of the Financial Administration Act. That means basically anyone working for any level of government is exempt if they are keeping animals as part of their duties or functions in their job. There is a lot of uncertainty amongst the industry regarding what some of those exemptions actually mean, because the bill provides little clarity. For example, does the reference to provincial licenses refer to existing licenses, or will the provinces need to create a licensing authority for the purpose of this bill? What if a zoo in Ontario is already recognized by the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs as engaging in research? Will this license be enough, or will you need another one? Every province already has its own system for protecting animal welfare, and some provinces like BC and Quebec have well-developed zoo regulations. There is no clarity about how this bill would overlay all of those. However, there is one big exception to the standards introduced by this legislation. In addition to the exceptions already mentioned, the offenses will not apply to anyone who the Minister of the Environment designates as an animal care organization. There is a long list of requirements for an organization to be designated as an eligible animal care organization. But if all those hoops are cleared and the organization receives the designation, it then retains the ability to keep and breed elephants, great apes, and any other designated animals if it basically gets a pass on this legislation. However, out of the 27 accredited zoos and aquariums, there are 7 which do not have to jump through these hoops. Instead, these institutions get to bypass every one of the required steps and are named right in the bill, giving them a perpetual get-out-of-jail-free card. These 7 are listed in sections 19(1) and include the Assiniboine Park Zoo, the Calgary Zoological Society, the Zoo de Granby, Montreal Biodome, Ripley's Aquarium of Canada, the Board of Management of the Toronto Zoo, and the Vancouver Aquarium. You will notice, colleagues, that African Lion Safari is not included in this list. This means that even though they are accredited through Canada's accredited zoos and aquariums known as CAZA, they will need to go through what could be a lengthy, arduous, and uncertain process to see if they will be allowed to continue the work, the great work they have been doing for over 50 years. Not only African Lion Safari, but 18 other zoos already accredited by Canada's accredited zoos and aquariums were not included in the list of the exempt zoos. All of them are potentially facing an existential crisis in the continuation of their work, their livelihoods, and the conservation efforts because of one simple reason. While they belong to Canada's accredited zoos and aquariums, they do not belong to the American-based Zoos Association of Zoos and Aquariums. Colleagues, we need to park here for a few minutes and consider the implications of this. Bill S-241 basically turns over the accreditation standards of Canadian zoos to an American Accreditation Association. I find that quite disturbing. As I was told over and over by the zoos which did not make the short list in the bill, why would we want to turn over our accreditation standards to an American organization? Colleagues, if you ask Senator Klein about this, he will claim that AZA is an international accreditation body active in 13 countries. This is only partly true. The AZA may be active in 13 countries, but the AZA American Nonprofit Corporation, whose board of directors is made up entirely by American citizens, AZA may be operating in 13 countries, but it is founded, run, and controlled by Americans. It has no Canadian representation on its board of directors. Senator Klein will also tell you that AZA has higher standards than CAZA, and that is why they were chosen. But I asked every zoo I visited about this, even the ones which are already AZA accredited, and found that Senator Klein's views is a minority viewpoint. Even accredited zoos themselves do not agree on which accreditation is better. In fact, in many cases, CAZA clearly has higher standards than AZA. But there's one thing that really got my attention. Last summer, the U.S. House of Representatives introduced a bill called the SWIMS Act. The purpose of this bill was to amend the U.S. Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972 and the Animal Welfare Act to prohibit the taking, importation, exportation, and breeding of certain cetaceans for public display and other purposes. That may not sound too outrageous to Canadians, since this is already law in Canada. But in the USA, colleagues, AZA opposed this bill. You can go to the AZA website, look it up, go to what they call their Legislative Education Center, and look for the part on SWIMS Act. You'll see that it says the following, and I quote, "The SWIMS Act would prohibit the breeding, importation, and exportation of orcas, beluga whales, false killer whales, and pilot whales. It would establish a dangerous precedent that would limit the ability of highly qualified staff in facilities like AZA accredited aquariums and zoos to make decisions about the animals in their care." Colleagues, the AZA is allowing themselves to be used as the standard for Canadian zoos, and yet they oppose animal welfare legislation that already exists right here in our country. And it doesn't end there. On September 22nd, 2022, the President and CEO of AZA sent a letter to its members. In part, this is what it said, and I quote, "It is critically important that we are unified and speak with one voice against this legislation. It is not just about the beluga or killer whales. The identical arguments are currently being made about elephants, great apes, giraffes, big cats, and other species. We must act now to communicate to Congress that this legislation establishes a dangerous precedent by undermining the ability of highly qualified staff in AZA accredited aquariums and zoos to make decisions about the animals in their care." Colleagues, I don't want to get partisan here, but that sounds like a Liberal government. Colleagues, it is not the AZA position that I am taking exception to. I actually think they make very good points. If you read their whole letter, it is their hypocrisy that I take exception with. Apparently, if this legislation is being introduced in the USA, then AZA sees it as a dangerous precedent. But if it's being introduced here in our country, it is fine. I don't think you can get any more hypocritical than that. This is an organization, colleagues, that doesn't even support the current Canadian standards. And Senator Klein wants to make them the benchmark for even higher standards, which they also don't agree with or comply with themselves. Colleagues, I want to reiterate that I am not opposed to stricter statutory and regulatory criteria for zoos. But I take great offense at giving a pass to a handful of Canadian zoos because they belong to an American organization which doesn't even support the current Canadian standards, never mind the standards that this bill is being put forward. When I visited zoos, which are CAZA accredited but not AZA accredited, I asked them, why have you not pursued the AZA accreditation? Trish Girth, the general manager of the African Lion Safari, said they actually considered accreditation through the AZA at one time. They had an AZA representative come up from the United States and do an initial review of their park, and the representative said he didn't think they would have any trouble qualifying. However, African Lion Safari decided not to go ahead with it because they saw the need for a strong Canadian organization which was exclusively focused on Canadian legislation and regulatory environment. I heard similar sentiment from other CAZA-accredited zoos. Why should we have an American organization telling Canada what its standards should be? I agree with that sentiment. Colleagues, in his second reading speech on this bill, Senator Klein mentioned the African lion safari a number of times, and each time his statements contained misinformation about this wildlife reserve. His first statement, colleagues, was this: in addition, the Jane Goodall Act bans the use of affected species in performances for entertainment as well as elephant rides, unless licensed by a provincial government. This is relevant to sea lions and walruses at Marineland and Niagara Falls, and to elephants at the African Lion Safari near Hamilton. He went on and said, African Lion Safari, 16 elephants have been used for performance for entertainment purposes and for rides resulting in an attack in 2019. CASA banned elephant rides that year. Let me give you some facts on that misinformation, colleagues. One, the insinuation that this legislation is somehow going to force African Lion Safari to cancel elephant rides is blatantly false. African Lion Safari, first of all, started phasing out elephant rides in their presentation and animal programs long before CASA banned them. And when CASA made the decision to ban rides, it was with the support of African Lion Safari. Make no mistake about it, there are no elephant rides at African Lion Safari for this bill to cancel. Secondly, Senator Klein said that using elephants for entertainment purposes and for rides resulted in an attack in 2019. This, colleagues, is also false. Yes, there was an incident, but it had nothing to do with elephant performances and rides. Through an investigation of the incident when it was completed by the Ontario Ministry of Labour, and African Lion Safari was never charged or found guilty of any kind of misconduct or animal abuse. The statements in Senator Klein's speech about African Lion Safari were misleading. Senator Klein also said the Jane Goodall Act would phase out elephant captivity in Canada, similar to our country's whale and dolphins law. The primary reason is that our climate is unsuitable, requiring these huge, far-ranging, intelligent, and social creatures to spend winters indoors. It is regrettable that Senator Klein did not visit the Wild Reserve before he made this statement, a reserve which has the largest herd of elephants in the country, before coming to his conclusions about the park and about how elephants fare in Canada. African Lion Safari is recognized worldwide for its expertise in elephant welfare. Their elephant care professionals are regularly consulted by conservation organizations worldwide for their input on issues of elephant welfare, healthcare management, and conservation. In 1998, African Lion Safari founded the International Elephant Foundation, along with several international partners, which is dedicated to the conservation of African and Asian elephants. In 2021, IEF supported 20 projects in 13 countries across 3 continents to invest in elephant welfare in places like Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Zambia, Namibia, Tanzania, Nepal, India, and Indonesia. African Lion Safari has been an active participant in AZA's Elephant Taxon Advisory Group for over 30 years. They are an advisor to the Asian Elephant Support Foundation, a program partner for the AZA Asian Elephant SAFE program, as well as a donor partner to the IUCN SSC Asian Elephant Specialist Group. In other words, they are experts. They strongly disagree with Senator Klein's characterization of how elephants fare in human care in Canada. Charlie Gray is the superintendent of elephants at African Lion Safari. He has worked hands-on with elephants since 1982 and has been the elephant manager at African Lion Safari since 1987. Charlie is a founding board member of the Elephant Managers Association and is a founding and current board member of the International Elephant Foundation. He served on the American Association of Zoos and Aquariums Taxon Advisory Group for the Asian Elephant Species Survival Program from 1988 to 2019. He is a world-renowned elephant expert. Charlie told us that contrary to what Senator Klein and other so-called experts would have you believe, the elephants in their care love the 4 seasons. This is partly because their herd of Asian elephants were born and raised in Canada and are very acclimatized to our winters. In fact, Charlie says their elephants actually prefer the cold to the heat, partly because there are no bugs. But they also love to run and play in the snow and break the ice on the lake and go swimming. Colleagues, I think we sent every one of you a short video of these elephants playing. If you haven't seen it, or you have deleted it, please let me know. I'd love to send it to you again, of elephants breaking the ice, running around, swimming in the cold. They have a heated enclosure in winter where they can come and go at will, and they do not hesitate to venture outside and enjoy the winter. African Lion Safari has done some fascinating research regarding the ability of Asian elephants to adapt to cold climates. They are leading research in infrared thermography and have found that the species has a previously unknown ability to send warm blood to their extremities in colder conditions, which helps to explain why they can enjoy the Canadian winters. I also found it somewhat puzzling to learn that the AZA permits elephants in captivity in the U.S., but not in Canada. They claim that this is because of the climate, and yet some of the locations of elephant herds in the southern part of Canada, such as African Lion Safari, experience much warmer temperatures than many of the U.S. locations that have elephants in their care. Colleagues, the assertion that elephants cannot thrive in human care in Canada is simply wrong, misleading. It ignores the plethora of evidence and finds its roots in emotion and not in reason. Next, colleagues, I went and visited a zoo called Parc Safari. Parc Safari is in Hemingford, Quebec. Parc Safari, like the African Lion Safari, transcends what we normally think of as a zoo. It would be better referred to as a wildlife preserve. Spread over 152 acres, that is the equivalent of 152 hectares, that is the equivalent of 375 acres, or 1.5 million square feet. The park has over 500 animals consisting of 97 different species. It keeps and breeds endangered species with the cooperation of zoological institutions in Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas. And unlike roadside zoos, all the animals at Parc Safari have access to large enclosures. Parc Safari is not a rescue center. They do not rescue and rehabilitate injured animals. That is not their specialty. Instead, they focus on the conservation of endangered species through reproduction and, when possible, reintroduction. In fact, Parc Safari has successfully reintroduced cheetahs to Africa that were born at the park. As Jean-Pierre Ranger, the owner of Parc Safari, noted in a media interview, there are only 2,000 to 3,000 cheetahs left in the wild in Africa. If today things are going a little better, it's because there are institutions like mine where we do reproduction, awareness, and reintroduction. When asked what he thinks of Bill S-241, Jean-Pierre did not mince words. He called it a Trojan horse. That is the first step towards the end of zoological institutions. You may or may not agree with Mr. Ranger, but the truth of the matter is that he has captured the precise sentiments of the animal rights movements who are big advocates of this bill. They are not even shy about it. One headline in a vegan publication reads, "A proposed federal bill in Canada could be the first step to phasing out the zoo industry." The article says the bill introduced in 2020 by former Senator Murray Sinclair and is now back in the Senate after being sidelined by the federal election in September 2021. It has many significant new policies that could be the first step to phasing out the zoo industry in the country. Victoria Schroff, a well-known animal rights lawyer in BC, wrote the following in a Canadian Lawyer magazine. In 2019, I asked a question in these pages. Is it time for animal rights in Canada? The answer has been delivered in the form of groundbreaking animal law put forward in November by Senator Murray Sinclair. Bill S-218 fits with my opinion that animals need access to justice. If passed, the bill will have wide-ranging applicability for animal welfare through Canada, as it proposes the strongest animal protection laws ever seen in this country. Speaking of access to justice, it would be surprising if I, along with some of my former university animal law students, now clinicians, at our newly launched animal law pro bono clinic run by the Law Students Legal Advice Program, ended up seeing novel types of animal law cases if this bill becomes law. You're going to be sued by your dog, colleagues. In other words, if this bill passes, you can expect that both exempt and non-exempt zoos will be litigated to death by the animal rights movement. This, colleagues, is not a conspiracy theory. They are transparent about their plan. They plan to use the legal system to push their agenda further. In a Vancouver Sun article entitled, "Are You Ready to Be Sued by Your Pet?" Victoria Schroff admitted that the animal rights movement is taking an incremental approach to advancing their agenda. She acknowledged that not everyone in the animal rights industry supports giving certain animals more rights than others because, this is what she says, they think it creates an exceptionalism or a speciesism where animals that are more recognizable and valued will be at the top of the chain, and ones less valued, like rats and chickens, will still be human fodder. Elephants and dolphins, ones that have language, where do you draw the line? I think we nudge open the courtroom doors to let whoever we can pass first, and the rest will follow. Whether you believe this bill will open the door to advance to extreme animal rights agenda or not, you need to realize the animal rights group believe that it will. They are almost giddy in their enthusiasm about the opportunities that this bill will yield for them if it passes. Colleagues, animal welfare is supported by all, but animal rights is quite another issue. It stops at nothing until all animals share the same rights as people. And this, colleagues, is the direction that Bill S-241 is pointing us. Senator Klein has acknowledged over and over that, and I quote, this legislation establishes limited legal standing for affected species. This is unprecedented in Canadian law and is being done by inventing something called an animal advocate. Even though the animal advocate's role will only come into play during sentencing, it is clearly the thin edge of the wedge. The animal rights groups are deliriously excited about it. Animal justice puts it this way. Aside from sweeping protections for many species of wild animals, animal justice is thrilled to see provisions that grant limited legal standing to animals when they're being illegally held in captivity. One of the biggest challenges animals face is having their interests considered in a courtroom. Listen to this, colleagues. But under the proposed new law, animal advocates can more easily give animals a much-needed voice in court to fight to protect them from cruelty. Under the proposed law, in a prosecution for illegally keeping or breeding an animal in captivity, a judge could hear legal arguments from a designated animal advocacy group or an individual. This individual or organization could ask the judge to take action to protect the best interests of an animal, including sending the animal to a sanctuary and improving their conditions. Make no mistake about it, colleagues, giving limited legal standing to animals will set us on a slippery slope, which will eventually impact not only zoos, but also agriculture. Multiple farm organizations have met with me to express their concern about this part of the bill because their legal counsel has warned them that it opens the door to extend the same legal status to non-domesticated animals. The simple fact, colleagues, is that animal rights movement is not coming after zoos, it's also coming after farms. Martin Rowe from the Cultural and Animals Foundation put it this way: it seems to me that we have an opportunity in animal protection movement to talk about the end of factory farming and the end of industrialized use of animals, the crop that goes to feed them, to restore watersheds, and to open up huge areas of land for rewilding. Jane Goodale herself on the title of this bill says, and I quote, "It seems clear that factory farms should be phased out, and if animals are farmed, they should be allowed to be out in the fields when the weather permits." Ms. Goodale went on to call for the phasing out of intensive farming of crops, multicultures, and agricultural chemicals. She believes we need to return to, quote, small-scale family farming. Colleagues, Canada is currently the 5th largest exporter of agricultural and agri-food products in the world, exporting worth $82.2 billion a year. We are blessed with favorable conditions for food production, which far exceed the needs of our population, which gives us the opportunity and responsibility to feed the world. Following Jane Goodale's advice would put an end to that. Make no mistake about it, this bill strengthens the ongoing assault on Canadian agriculture. The agenda of animal rights activists is not just to end the use of animals in zoos, but eventually see it spread to agriculture as well. I recognize that this bill does not directly advocate for that, but by crossing the line, it gives animals legal standing in court. It strengthens that movement and undeniably pushes us in that direction. Out of the 10 zoos I visited and spoke to, every single one of them expressed concerns about this part of the bill, even those zoos that are exempt from the bill because they're AZA accreditation. Jean-Pierre Ranger was correct. This bill is a Trojan horse. As I said earlier, it is a clumsy effort at a noble cause and will have more negative impacts than positive ones. After Park Safari, I visited the Granby Zoo, the Montreal Ecu-Museum, and Park Omega. All of these are in Quebec. All of them are doing great work in conservation and education. Yet only one of them gets a get-out-of-jail-free card, the Granby Zoo. The rest will have to run the gauntlet set up by this bill to see if they will be designated as an animal care organization. Ironically, out of the 3 zoos, only one which has any elephant, great apes, or big cats, only one that has an elephant, great ape, and a big cat is the Granby Zoo, and they get the get-out-of-jail-free card. That is the only Quebec zoo which received an automatic exemption in this bill. Neither the Ecu-Museum or Park Omega have these animals, and yet it is Granby Zoo which got the pass. The Eco-Museum is 30 minutes from downtown Montreal. It is the one and only zoo on the island of Montreal and has the executive director, David Rodrigue, explained to me. The zoo only has Quebec wildlife. It has no lions, no tigers, no cheetahs, no elephants, no gorillas. They do have lynx, wolves, and bears. And for some reason, all these animals are covered by the bill, even though they are native to Quebec and require neither international or international importation. Which brings us to the question of jurisdiction. Bill S-241 attempts to legislate in 2 areas of federal responsibility. 1, the exercise of federal power over international and interprovincial trade, and 2, the exercise of federal power over criminal animal cruelty and criminal public safety matters. But it is difficult to see what this has to do with domestic species native to Quebec. Park Omega raised the same concerns with me about jurisdiction. Park Omega has a safari-type zoo with large natural spaces spread out over, colleagues, 2,000 acres. 2,000 acres, which are home to over 20 species of animals living in their natural environment. Throughout most of the park, visitors drive through enclosures and view the animals from the safety of their vehicle. The park places a strong emphasis on reconnecting people to nature, to our history, and to the customs and belief of the Indigenous peoples of Quebec. One of the park's main attraction is their wolf packs. They have 5 wolf packs consisting of between 5 and 13 wolves per pack, totaling 60 wolves. These are all Canis lupus species, which are protected under Bill S-241. The park has a program, and it's called Sleep with the Wolves, where you can rent a cabin, chalet, or lodge for the night. We didn't spend the night, but we spent an hour in one of these accommodations. Panoramic windows. The accommodations allow you to observe a pack of wolves in their natural habitat from every angle, thanks to the lodge's panoramic views. The wolves walk right up to the front room. Feels like you could pet them. The other side of the glass. The program is so popular, colleagues, that there is currently a 1-year waiting list to book accommodations. When Alain Massey, the park's general manager, and Serge Lucier, the technical director and spokesperson, were showing me the facilities, there were no wolves to be seen at first. Then Serge opened up the door and called to the wolves, and they began appearing like shadows in the forest. At first until they came into clear view right up to the windows of the cabin. It was breathtaking. I can see why people want to get up close to these majestic animals. However, the wolf falls under provincial jurisdiction, as noted by Environment Canada. Provincial and territorial governments are responsible for the management of terrestrial wildlife. The wolf is legally protected through various provincial and territorial wildlife acts. Under these acts, certain uses of Canadian wildlife care are under specific regulations and only with the provisions of licenses or permits. And these licenses or permits include the hunting and harvesting of wolves. The hunting and harvesting of wolves. Environment Canada explains that the gray wolf is classified as both a fur bearer and a game animal in most jurisdictions. The majority of trade in gray wolf from Canada is for pelts, hunting trophies, and fur garments. In other words, while Bill S-241 wants to make it a criminal offense to hold these animals in captivity, it will still be completely illegal to hunt them or harvest them when they are not in captivity. The second they set foot off of the park's yard, they can be hunted. The disconnect is somewhat mind-boggling. It makes one wonder, how exactly did these 800 species, there's 800 species, colleagues, that are listed, that I'm not sure who made up the list. Government didn't make up the list. I'm not sure whether Senator Klein did it on his own, but it came. Senator Sinclair's didn't have that list, but now 800 species that get on the list of Bill S-241. Bill S-218 only listed elephants and great apes. Any additional species were added by cabinet, I guess, after consulting with professionals in animal science, veterinary medicine, or animal care, and with representatives of groups whose objects include the promotion of animal welfare on the capability of species to live in captivity, and whether the conditions of captivity adequately accommodate the biological and ecological needs for individual animals of that species to live a good life. That was S-218. But then 241 shows up with a list of 800 species already attached. Colleagues, how did these species get on the list? How are we supposed to approve a list with 800 species written right into it when we have not had the opportunity to carry out the consultations with Cabinet itself that Cabinet will be required to conduct? Are we just supposed to trust these consultations have been done by Senator Klein and take his word for it that they should all be on there? Are we going to examine each of these species at committee? Or are we just going to pass legislation that we have not properly vetted? Now, I'll be honest, tacking a list of 800 species onto a bill that originally contained only 2 seems a bit presumptuous to me. If we were to pass this, it would be a repudiation of our role as legislators, who are supposed to provide sober second thought unless we first verify that each species on this list meets the criteria outlined in the bill. The inclusion of the gray wolf in this bill is a perfect example of the dangers of not doing our job. The gray wolf is neither endangered nor threatened. The general status of species in Canada classifies the gray wolf as secure. Jurisdictions report stable or increasing populations, and no acute widespread threats to the species have been identified. And yet, for some reason, unknown to us at this time, Senator Klein has included the species in the bill. Was there pressure from animal rights groups to do so? Did Animal Justice insist that the wolves be included in order for Senator Klein to get their endorsement of the bill? We have no idea, because this chamber has been provided with no background information, no scientific studies, no veterinary reports, and no readouts from consultations. It's opaque, and that, colleagues, is not acceptable. Colleagues, believe it or not, the first draft of this speech was much longer. It really was. Because there is much more that can be said and indeed needs to be said. And while I am sorry that I have not been able to visit more zoos by this time, you are probably thankful I only made it to 10. So let me wrap up. This bill claims to help animals, but it will do the opposite. While the bill sponsor regularly tells us that it is urgent to pass this bill. We've heard it here. Plett stalling the bill. It is urgent we pass this bill. On the day the bill passes into law, colleagues, not a single roadside zoo will close because of it. Not one. Every single animal currently in a substandard roadside zoo is grandfathered in and will have to live out their lives in those conditions. I would note that the average lifespan of a tiger in captivity is 22 years. Lions live for about 25 years. Elephants for about 60 to 70 years. This bill will leave animals suffering in roadside zoos untouched, while immediately threatening the future of great conservation efforts like African Lion Safari, Park Omega, and more. How often have we heard how elephants are sociable animals? How animals need friends, they need companions, they need lovers. These animals will slowly die until there will be one animal all by himself or herself with no companion. And worse yet, on top of doing nothing to help animals which are truly suffering, it will add to their suffering by requiring them to be neutered or somehow kept from breeding, thus impose even more hardship on them and depriving them of even more of their dignity. Furthermore, while doing nothing to help animals in roadside zoos, the bill will undoubtedly impact the great conservation work done by 18 CASA-accredited zoos, which were not consulted in the creation of this bill. They were refused an exemption. Instead of helping conservation efforts, this legislation will create a chill for those great institutions which will now have to be concerned about their long-term viability and their ability to carry on their vital conservation work. Colleagues, Jane Goodall herself has endorsed zoos and important institutions for conservation. She said, "There is a mistaken belief that animals in their natural habitat are, by definition, better off. Sadly, this is not necessarily true. Wild animals face unprecedented pressures today, such as habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, and climate change. That was Jane Goodall, colleagues. Conservation is critical for future generations to be able to enjoy the wildlife we take for granted today. This bill threatens that work by refusing to recognize the value of Canadian accreditation and imposing American standards on Canadian zoos, even though in many cases those American standards are lower than our own. Something needs to be done, colleagues, but Bill S-241 is not the way forward. As I said, it carries the precision of an elephant in a china shop or a tiger in a chicken coop. It will not get the job done, but it will make a very large mess in the process. We need to defeat this bill, colleagues. I encourage the government to come up with legislation which is balanced, effective, and responsive to our own Canadian accredited zoos. For the sake of animal welfare in our nation and for the sake of incredible conservation work currently being carried out, I would like to urge you to vote against this bill at second reading. I will reluctantly, colleagues, not ask for a recorded on this vote. I will allow this bill to be passed at second reading on division so that the three committees that were listed earlier today can begin their work and try to bring us a bill that makes sense to our country. Thank you, colleagues. Hear, hear.